Good evening from the Gail Lemron Auditorium and the Captain Willie Miller Building on the campus of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Welcome to the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series. I'm Marc Bernier, moderator for tonight's event. Russia has been in and out of the news in the last couple of years. Everything from a government shutdown recently to trouble in foreign areas. There is one consistency: the relationship between Russia and the United States. Tonight, we will spotlight one of the great Russian leaders. How did he relate to the United States, and what did we think of him? Did he change his mind? Why did the bosses throw him overboard? And how does he fall in with the rest of the Russian leadership? Khrushchev, Stalin, Lenin, and then Vladimir Putin. In between then, there were a few other leaders. We'll talk about it with the Pulitzer Prize winning author of the book about Khrushchev. He has interviewed Mikhail Gorbachev 8 times. He and his wife Jane traveled to Russia, where they both speak Russian, and had a chance to talk with Gorbachev about his life and what power meant and how the Soviets look at their leaders. It is our great privilege to present for the first time here at Embry-Riddle tonight the author of the book Gorbachev, William C. Taubman. Can't thank you enough for coming to Daytona Beach.
My pleasure.
We met in Miami at the Miami Book Fair, and when I started reading this book, I really do read these things, I was amazed at the detail about Gorbachev. We'll talk about him first, and then we're going to talk about the other leaders and come back. But Gorbachev was such a different leader. A member of our audience wanted to know, isn't it true that the Russians in general frown upon weak leadership? They don't like anybody soft. They like hard leadership. Is that what the people like and expect from their leaders?
I'm afraid that's true, as Gorbachev himself discovered to his horror. He tried to change Russia for the better. He tried to democratize a country which had never known democracy, except for 5 chaotic months or a few more in 1917. And at first he was very popular, but over time, as the economic situation deteriorated, people turned against him. And you might be interested to know that in retrospect, some of the things they cite to prove how weak he was. I'll give you 2 examples. They say things like, he changed his mind.
Yeah.
And they say, he listened. I mean, I didn't think it was a sin to listen, and I didn't think it was a sin to change your mind, but these are the kinds of things they say to prove that he was weak.
Let me back up, because you got the Pulitzer for Khrushchev. What made you so fascinated by Russian leadership?
Well, I've tried to figure that out myself. I grew up, I went to school in the 50s, high school, college in the early 60s. This was the height of the Cold War. Khrushchev was in power, although I never thought I'd write his biography. Eisenhower, Kennedy, the Cold War was on. It was exciting. It was the news at the top of the hour every day. So that was part of it. Another was that on my mother's side, the family had emigrated from Russia. And although my mother didn't speak Russian, my grandparents did, I wasn't aware of that as an influence, but it must have had an effect on me. And the other thing, I think at that time, I was already puzzling over the fact that Stalin had become a mass murderer, that is, the purges, totalitarianism. And yet I knew that it had started with Marx, and I was beginning to read Karl Marx. And I couldn't quite figure out how Marx's vision of heaven on earth, that's what it was, could produce hell on earth. And I asked myself the question, was it an inevitable causal chain from Marx to Stalin, or could the chain have been broken many times in history? So maybe I'm attributing too much to myself in retrospect, but I think it was ideas like this and experiences like this that made me start studying Russian as a freshman in college and Russian history as my major.
Was he always ambitious?
Was
Gorbachev always ambitious?
Well, you have to go back, as we did, my wife and I, over his childhood. He grew up in a small peasant village in southern Russia. His parents were peasants. His mother was illiterate. His father had a modicum of literacy. But Gorbachev, from the very beginning, had the idea that he could become somebody great. It's one of these mysteries. Where does that kind of thing come from? And it's interesting that when we asked him, he sort of shied away from answering, as if he didn't want to dig too deep into his own psychology. But we do know that by the time he was in high school, he was a star, and he was already a kind of arrogant young man. I'll tell you one example. He had a girlfriend, and she was in charge of the high school newspaper, and one day he came in and discovered she hadn't done the job right, and he bawled her out. And then, when they met with the editorial board, he bawled her out again. And then as they left the school, he asked her out that evening. And she said to him, "How can you treat me this way? First you bawl me out, and then you ask me out." And his response was something like, "My dear, these are two different realms." There was a kind of, he was full of himself, even from that early age.
The project took 10 years in research for Gorbachev, 20 years for Khrushchev, and you don't teach at Amherst any longer. You retired a few years ago. So 30 years of writing again about Soviet leaders. What kind of life was that like for you and Jane?
Well, it meant I had to prepare for classes pretty quickly, and it meant I kept teaching the same courses instead of changing them every year. But there is a kind of positive feedback between teaching and writing. And in fact, when I was finishing up the Gorbachev book, I was teaching a seminar on Gorbachev. And I actually gave the students in my class my manuscript to read. I was hoping they would be critical, but since I was grading them, they weren't so critical. But they said things that I had never thought of. I'll give you one example. Gorbachev talks in his memoirs about how when he ran to be the chief of the Young Communist League cell in his high school, he got up to nominate himself, as others were doing, and one of the other kids, pulled the chair out from under him so that when he tried to sit back down on his chair, he collapsed on the floor. And I thought this was just funny, amusing. I put it in the book, and the students in my class said, "What did that mean? Did that mean they didn't like him? Or did they like him and just were doing something they would have done to anybody?" I'm not sure, but that was a sort of student eye view of something that I hadn't thought about very much myself.
What was it that you learned about Gorbachev as to why people turned on him and took him out of power? Was there a single incident, or was it building for a long period of time?
Well, we knew, people who were paying close attention at the time knew that Russians were increasingly unhappy. My family and I spent 5 months in Moscow in 1988, and my wife and I wrote a book when we came back called Moscow Spring, which was a play on the phrase Prague Spring, which was what they called the Czech experiment in democracy in 1968. And we went to the stores, we shopped, we lived the life of Russians, and it was already difficult to get many of the things that we take for granted. Sugar, soap, all kinds of problems. And the Russians we knew were increasingly unhappy.
How difficult was it for you to get Gorbachev to talk with you? I mean, I think there's 8 interviews that you do with him.
Well, when I got the idea to write the book, I thought of asking his permission. But then I decided the trouble with asking his permission is he might say no. So instead, I told him that I was going to do it, and I asked his support. And I asked this through one of his closest aides. This guy sort of vouched for me, I think, because he had read my Khrushchev book and I had met him. And the word came back that Gorbachev would be supportive. But then, 2 or 3 years later, when Jane, my wife, and I went to Moscow, and we asked for our first interview with him, the word came back, he will see you once, and then depending upon how it goes, he might see you a second time. So I thought, we have to have a strategy. And the strategy had 2 parts. The first part was to prepare every question based on something he had said in his writing or in his speeches. And the idea was to prove I had done my homework, and also to make sure that he didn't simply repeat himself, because he knew I had quoted him and he would say something different. And the other part was to start with his grandparents. We knew that he was rather long-winded, and I figured if I started in the 1930s, at the end of the first interview, we'll be lucky if we get to 1950. And since he'll want to talk about his time in power, he'll agree to a second interview. Well, that spring we had 5 long interviews, and we even didn't get to the end in that. So I don't want to take too much credit. I think we learned he's a warm, informal man with a sense of humor. He also has a big ego. He wants to be thought of well. He hoped I would write a positive biography. So it was a combination of mostly his eagerness to talk and our little game, our strategy.
Did he bring Raisa, his wife, Gorbachev's wife, into the discussion? Did you meet her?
She had died, alas, before I embarked on the project. She died in 1999 of leukemia. And by the way, maybe we can come back to this. He was a wonderful husband, a devoted husband and father to their daughter and to their grandfather to their granddaughters. It's a rare case, I fear, of true love between a politician and his wife. We know often that doesn't work out that way. But when she died, he said, "I am guilty. I am the one who did her in." And one of the things we tried to find out was what he meant. And I think what he meant was that she was temperamentally not suited to the role of First Lady. She invented it in Russia. The previous First Ladies had stayed out of the limelight entirely. She was a First Lady, smart, beautiful, stylish, but internally, psychologically, she found it was too much pressure. And when the country turned against her husband, she found it incredibly painful. And she asked him to retire, and he refused. And after he was thrown out in 1991, he insisted on running for president of Russia in 1996, and he got in that election less than 1% of the vote. Wow. And yet she tagged along as he campaigned across the country, and that must have contributed to finishing her off.
I had got a chance to have lunch with Bill today, and it was a thrill. I kept feeling guilty because I held him up so long at lunch with questions. But there is an incident in which you and Jane are with Gorbachev, and he has this interesting off sense of humor. Jane understands some of the language, you understand some of the language, and he got to a part where Gorbachev is describing something in a garden there, and all of a sudden, Jane couldn't come up with the word for, I think, cherry plum. What happened?
Yes. Well, first of all, one should say that we fully expected him to insist on there being an interpreter there, his interpreter, to make sure that we got it right, but he didn't insist. So there we were, the two of us, who speak very good Russian, but not absolutely perfectly, especially when it comes to gardens and plants and gardens. So he's describing his grandfather's garden, and he mentions cherry plums, and I look at Jane, and she looks at me, and we don't know what the hell he's talking about. Whereupon he gets up and in mock horror says to Jane, "I thought you were a Russian specialist, and yet you don't know the word cherry plum." So this is not hilarious, but it's a sign of his informality and sense of humor.
To showcase, and I recommend this book to anyone who hasn't read the detail, when he was removed from power, he could have lived anywhere. He could have lived in Germany, I believe you wrote.
Yes.
He could have come to the United States, but he lived alone and with bodyguards and cooks, I guess, and his daughter, though, moves away?
Well, in the beginning, as long as his wife was alive, of course, they were together. And when she died, their daughter moved in with him, with her 2 daughters, and eventually her second husband. But within the last few years, she has been spending most of her time, the daughter, in Germany with her daughters. And so it's really a very sad outcome. He lives alone, except for chefs and bodyguards and chauffeurs, in this villa outside of Moscow. And as his health has deteriorated, he comes into the office. He's driven in a limousine. But people have described to me the scene. He comes in and sits at his desk and has nothing to do. So I depict him in the book as what I call a tragic hero. A hero because he created the first Russian free elections. He created the first Russian functioning parliament. He gave them free speech, initially called glasnost. And he, along with Ronald Reagan and George Bush, and with a helping hand from Margaret Thatcher and other leaders, ended the Cold War. This is major contribution. But I think he's a tragic hero because his own flaws contributed to bringing him low in the end, and because, in my view, in retrospect, the task he set for himself to democratize this country was probably doomed from the start in a country which had never known democracy and whose people were impatient with a man who let them speak and listen to them, as I said.
Let's talk about the relationship between Gorbachev and the Reagans. It appears to Western eyes that Gorbachev really likes Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan likes him. There's a dichotomy here. You've got those two, and then you have the wives, and the wives don't like each other. Let's take them separately.
Yes, okay.
First, Gorbachev and Reagan. How genuine is that what appears to be an outward affection?
I think it was real. When Gorbachev came in March 1985, Reagan, in his eyes and Soviet eyes, was an ogre. He talked about the evil empire. He had started promoting the Strategic Defense Initiative. You guys here at Embry-Riddle University know all about it. Will recall his plan for a Star Wars system that would knock down rockets before they could reach the United States. And Gorbachev and the Soviets thought this guy was impossible. They would never get along with him. They felt threatened by him, which is what Reagan wanted. But Reagan had another side to him. His plan was to threaten them and then negotiate with them. And when Gorbachev came in, the two met at Geneva in November 1985. And I've read the transcripts of all of their talks, and I've talked to their aides on both sides who were there. And when you read what they said to each other, there's no contact, there's no communication. And in fact, at one point, Gorbachev comes back to talk to his associates, and he says, this guy is a primitive, he's a caveman. But they discovered they had some things in common. The most important one was that they both wanted to abolish nuclear weapons, which actually very few of their advisors thought was a good idea. But they both wanted to do that. And the other thing that I argue at some length in the book, and I won't do so here, is there were a lot of parallels in their lives. And Reagan talks about that in his memoirs. In fact, he did at the time. He says, we both come from small towns, and yet here we are with the fate of the world in our hands. There are a lot of other parallels too, but the most striking one to me, I came across a description of the Reagans' marriage by a writer who wrote about the Reagans. And if you take that description, you can substitute Gorbachev for Reagan, and Raisa, Gorbachev's wife, for Nancy, and it describes the Gorbachev's marriage. So my point is that I think there are similarities that created the personal chemistry which allowed them to talk, and then at the next summit, they almost abolished nuclear weapons, Reykjavik, 1986. Of course, if they'd come back to their capitals, if Reagan had brought that back to Washington and said, I've agreed to abolish nuclear weapons, the Joint Chiefs of Staff would have had a fit because they didn't want to do that. But Reagan and Gorbachev couldn't agree. And then they had a summit in Washington in December 87, and in Moscow in June 88, and in New York in December 88. And by the time they were through, Reagan was saying the evil empire was another time, another era. He was vouching for Gorbachev.
You told me that very quietly, and to someone he once admitted before the wall came down in Berlin, that maybe one day that wall will come down. And it was so anticlimactic in Russia, they didn't even wake him up when the wall came down?
Yeah. Gorbachev's dream was to transcend the Cold War and to bring East and West Europe together. I think what he imagined would eventually happen would be that both NATO and the Warsaw Pact would fade away. And instead, there'd be some new security architecture in Europe. And in that sense, the wall was an obstacle to what he wanted. And the aides who didn't wake him up at 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning on November 9th, 1989, when the wall came down, I think sensed that. Now, this dream of his was utopian. It didn't happen. It was unrealistic. But that's the kind of man he was. He was a dreamer. He was a kind of romantic. It's hard to imagine a man who can be a dreamer and at the same time a shrewd bureaucratic operator, which he also was. But people are complicated, and he was.
Did Gorbachev want to be a capitalist? Did he want some form of capitalism in his country?
You know, the three major directions for the reforms that he carried out were foreign affairs, I've talked about that a little bit, political reform, elections, parliament, free speech, and market economy. The market economy was the one he was most doubtful about. That's partly because he had no experience with it, and because he remained a kind of socialist who was skeptical of capitalism and the market. But he was also afraid that if they introduced a market, in the initial stage there would be rampant inflation and high unemployment, and so he backed off. There was a time in 1990 when Yeltsin and his people and some of Gorbachev's people came up with a plan which they called the 500 Days Plan. And the idea was to create a market economy in 500 days, which sounds like lunacy. I don't think you can do it that fast. Well, Gorbachev was afraid that it would produce chaos. And in a sense, it did, because when Yeltsin came in, they tried something like it. And for 10 years, inflation went crazy, hidden unemployment rose, people were miserable, and Russians look back on that 10 years of Yeltsin's as a terrible time of troubles, as they call it.
Let's back up. Contrast of styles. You get the Pulitzer for writing about Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev, who many people thought was a tyrant in this country. We still have the image of banging the shoe at the UN. You got to tell this, Bill. He doesn't bang the shoe. There's no proof that he banged the shoe at the UN.
Well, everybody thinks he did, and I've gone around and given talks when that book came out, and I would ask the audience, how many of you saw film of Khrushchev banging his shoe at the UN? And almost everybody thinks they can remember seeing something like that. But I found people who were there. The New York Times correspondent who was in the hall said he didn't bang his shoe, although another New York Times correspondent who was outside claimed that he did. The chief United Nations photographer said we had our cameras trained on him. He was holding the shoe in his hand, but he never banged it. And then I gave a talk in Washington when the book came out, and people who had been in the US government at that time came to the talk. One guy got up and said, I was there 5 yards from him, and I can tell you he did bang his shoe. And then another guy got up and said, well, I was there, and I can tell you he did not bang his shoe. And then a third guy got up and said, he had the shoe in his hand, and the hand hit the table, but the shoe never hit the table.
Was Khrushchev a bully, or was that just an image that he put out for our consumption?
Well, when he said, we will bury you, he claimed in retrospect that he meant that metaphorically. You know, we will We will defeat you. He didn't mean it literally, that we will have a war and you will lose and we will bury your corpses. But he was an explosive man with a temper, and he was impulsive, and he also was operating from a position of strategic weakness. You remember you probably don't remember, but some of you do. There was the notion in the late 50s of a missile gap in Soviet favor. It turned out, once we had the U-2 spy planes and the spy satellites, that the missile gap was in our favor, not theirs. He had bluffed and blustered. He said, we have an anti-missile that can hit your missiles in the sky. They had nothing like that. He said, we are turning out missiles like sausages. He loved that kind of image, food, sausages, but they really weren't. And in fact, in my understanding of the Cuban Missile Crisis, one reason he put those missiles in Cuba was to make up for the imbalance in the United States' favor in intercontinental missiles. But at any rate, he bluffed and he blustered and he scared the hell out of us.
Yeah.
And that's the way he functioned, from weakness.
50 years ago, here at Embry-Riddle, some of you may have been here when we did a retrospect on the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was 6 years ago we did that. But it wasn't until I started reading Khrushchev and saw your interview with Brian Lamb that I learned that Castro wasn't even crazy about this guy. I mean, he wasn't even sure he wanted the missiles, and they had some friction there for a bit of time.
That's a fascinating story. When Khrushchev first proposed putting the missiles in Cuba, Castro wasn't convinced, and the Russians had to reassure him that they would handle the situation and it would all go well. And then he agreed, as if, you know, these Russians have been around longer than we have, so we'll go along with it. So they put the missiles in, and then when Khrushchev decides to take them out under various threats after the blockade and threats of bombing, at that point, he doesn't consult Castro. He just takes them out. And at that point, Castro goes crazy. And Khrushchev sends his associate, Anastas Mikoyan, to Havana to tell Castro, to soothe Castro. And Castro won't even see him for several days. He's so angry. So, you know, this relationship, which might have looked from our position as if they were very close and cozy, in some ways wasn't. Of course, if the missiles were there and if they had ever been used, it wouldn't have mattered very much whether they were cozy or not.
In this country, when a president leaves office, they're not totally gone. We hear from them. More often than not, in the last 25 to 45 years, we continue to hear from presidents after they leave office. When you're the president in the Soviet Union and you're no longer in charge, you disappear. But in the case of Khrushchev, and I believe that's the correct pronunciation, because I practiced that one.
Well, actually, the correct Russian pronunciation is Khrushchev. And I mentioned that because,
I'm not even going there.
Because Kennedy, when Kennedy called him Chairman Khrushchev,
yeah.
and when Kennedy called him Chairman Khrushchev, he was making 4 pronunciation mistakes in one word. Instead of kha, he called him ka. He had the accent on the wrong syllable. In the middle, instead of Khrushchev, he said Khrushchev. So this is not a major fact, but for your trivia games at home, you might want to remember it. What was the question again?
Well, that's the background. You could all practice at home.
Oh, yes. They disappear, yes.
Yeah, they disappear. And in Nikita Khrushchev's situation, he goes to, the Black Sea for 5 months. He's got some kind of villa there, and they call him back.
Well, this is the occasion on which he was ousted in October 1964. He went off on vacation. It's interesting that Gorbachev in 1991 went off on vacation to the Black Sea, and he was put under house arrest. Well, in October 64, Khrushchev was summoned back to Moscow, where he was dumped. He was ousted. So the lesson is, if you're the Soviet or Russian leader, beware vacations.
Yeah.
Unless you're as strong as Putin is, in which case he seems to be able to get away with it.
And we're going to get to him in just a moment. Going back one more time, Stalin. I didn't know this. How many, show of hands, how many knew that there was a famine in Russia right after World War II? Wow, you guys are better
And there was
than I
another
am.
one in the 1930s. There was one in the early 30s connected to collectivization, and then there were, well, really in 44 and again in 46.
Not to be shocking, but did you know that they cannibalized their own people following World War II? I did not know that
Yes.
until I read your book.
One of many, many horrors that characterize Russian history, especially under Stalin.
And you told me today, Adolf Hitler is credited with killing, eliminating, I think, 6 million Jews and countless others. But if you count all the people that Stalin had killed, it would, what, be?
Well, nobody knows exactly. There are all kinds of estimates. We
More
know
than
the one thing that they do know, apparently, on the basis of finding it in the KGB archives, is that in either maybe 1937, 38, they shot more than 600,000 people in the cellars of KGB prisons, but that just scratches the surface, because collectivization, when they collectivized agriculture, they killed millions of peasants, either on the spot or they put them on trains and sent them to Siberia, where they either died on the trains or they died once they got there in the conditions that they were working in. Then the terror of the 1930s, the famine. Solzhenitsyn, remember him? He used to claim that the toll was 60 million. I think that's not generally accepted, but a lot of historians will say that as many as 20 million died.
It's horrific to think of this. So Stalin, I'm thinking about Yalta, the Yalta Conference, where you have FDR, Churchill, I believe, and there's Uncle Joe.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, what's Roosevelt thinking? Does he know that this guy's a mass murderer of his own people? And he just pretends that
I don't think he knows the full truth. And whatever he knows, he's convinced himself nonetheless that he can negotiate with this guy. He and Churchill, they call Stalin Uncle Joe between themselves. And in their correspondence, Roosevelt and Churchill they contract it even more, and they refer to Stalin as UJ, Uncle Joe. And Roosevelt tries to charm Stalin. And this was an illusion. Stalin was very cold-blooded and wasn't going to be charmed. In fact, he later said to one of his associates that Churchill was an obvious enemy and that Roosevelt was actually more dangerous and devious because he tried to appear so charming.
Roosevelt dies in office. Here comes Truman. What does Stalin think?
Well, they meet at Potsdam, and in the beginning, Truman tries to follow in Roosevelt's footsteps, and he is reasonable and tries to listen and make some concessions. But before long, and in fact very quickly, he's disillusioned and comes to think of Stalin as the dictator, the dangerous dictator that he was. And then I'm afraid, as I see the Cold War, we kind of lurch from thinking too well of Stalin to thinking that he is a kind of demon who has superpowers and that a war may be all too likely. Stalin was a devil, all right, but he didn't want a war. Or if he did want a war, he didn't want to fight it himself. He agreed to let the North Koreans attack South Korea in 1950, convinced by Kim Il-sung. He hesitated at first, but then he let it go, and he sent pilots, of course, and the Chinese moved in. But Stalin didn't want to get in a real war with the United States, and he didn't.
So we come to what many of you are here to hear, Vladimir Putin. I think you told me today he's 65 years old. He has engineered things so that he may be able to run for office again and stay, another 6 years?
Yes, he's almost certainly, I'll put it this way, he is going to run for office later this year unless he's hit by a truck. And he has changed the Constitution, so he will have a 6-year term. And if you count the period from 2008 to 2012, when his buddy, sidekick, Medvedev, was the president while Putin pulled the strings as prime minister. Putin will eventually have been in office for 24 years, from 2000 to 2024. That is, well, let's take Stalin. It depends when you want to say he started. Let's call it 1929, and he died in 1953, 24 years. That is an amazing result. And nobody apparently can stop him. Although there are some signs that after having won the hearts of many Russians by improving the economy with a little help from oil and gas prices, and then when the economy began to fade and American sanctions and higher prices for oil and gas began to hurt, then he found another device. He annexed the Crimea and he invaded Ukraine. And many Russians love that because Crimea had always been thought of as part of Russia. And it's the closest thing the Russians have to Florida. Except it isn't Florida, it's nowhere near as far south. So Putin has kept his popularity up. His popularity rating is in the 80s.
But how low is it going to go when you got a gun pointed at the pollsters? You like him? Do you like him?
Well, I have to qualify that a little bit. He's been careful that way too. He's left safety valves. There is one newspaper in Moscow called Novaya Gazeta, of which Gorbachev is a co-owner, a minority owner, which tells the truth. There is one radio station in Moscow called Echo Moskvy, Echo of Moscow, which tells the truth. So, he's smart that way. He doesn't try to clamp down on everything. He allows a safety valve to let off steam. And there are other differences between the current Russian situation and Stalinist totalitarianism. People are free to travel abroad if they have enough money. In Soviet times, you needed permission from the state, which you didn't get if they suspected you. And these days, they even allow plays, occasional plays or movies, which are critical. In other words, this is not in my view, a fully totalitarian regime. I would call it an authoritarian regime. So in that sense, he is a tyrant, but he knows how to ease and release the pressure so as to try to keep the steam, the opposition, from building up. And so far, he's succeeded.
Here's the big question for Professor Taubman. Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump. Is he playing Trump? Does Trump think he's being played? You've been watching these people as a political scientist for well over 40 years. What do you think?
Well, I start with the fact that Trump gave every indication of admiring Putin and wanting to get along with him, and if possible, make some kind of deal that would ease tensions with Russia. That was obvious to all of us, I think, and certainly to Putin. And Putin wanted that because, in his view, what he'd like is to be able to annex Crimea and invade Ukraine and not have sanctions and get along as if nothing was wrong. So I think he wanted Trump. He also hated Hillary Clinton. That too is very clear. Now, and it also appears to be clear, although I'm not the CIA or the FBI, it appears to be clear that the Russians tried to hurt Hillary and help Trump. Whether there was collusion or not is another question which will be decided by others than me. But there is something ironic here. As shrewd as Putin was in organizing the meddling in our election, as clever as he was in doing that in all the ways they apparently did, he missed something crucial, which is that if it ever became clear that he had done this, there would be a tremendous backlash in the United States, which would limit Trump's ability to make a deal with him. And that's exactly what's happened. So if what Putin wanted was for Trump to come to power and to make some sort of accommodation. It hasn't worked out that way, and I can't imagine it because so many people in both parties have now turned against Putin for meddling in the American election. So you have to figure out this puzzle. How could he be so smart, Putin that is, to meddle in the way he did, and so stupid as not to see the logical consequences of that kind of meddling? And I have two theories about that. One is that he was misled into thinking, and he would not be the first Soviet or Russian leader to think this way, he was misled into assuming that an American president, Trump or anybody else, would have powers akin to his own. In other words, he projected onto the American scene the notion of a very powerful leader who can get his way. And he didn't remember the various constraints in the United States, even on a president, a free press, Congress when it chooses to act that way, interest groups, activists. This has happened before. That is, I think Stalin exaggerated Roosevelt's ability to dictate to the American people. This has happened all along. So that's one theory. The other theory is that Putin is playing a long game, and that what happens under Trump is the short run, but the long run, what he's trying to do is to destabilize democracy, both in the United States and in Europe. And whether it's as a result of what he's done or not, there seems to be some destabilization going on, as we read in the paper every day. So, if that's his game, one might say he's succeeding. But if his game was to play Trump and get a deal out of it, that's not working. I'll say one more thing. The KGB, it's now called the FSB. It's the Soviet, now Russian secret police. They are very shrewd at analyzing the weaknesses of their opponents. And that extends to psychological weaknesses too. And I don't think they fail to notice some of Trump's vulnerabilities. What exactly they did to play on them, I don't know, but I think they tried. And one more point while we're on Trump and Putin. They're very different people. Putin is much more calculating, I think, coldly calculating. Trump is more likely to just tweet, shall we say, to choose a verb not entirely at random. But in one important way, they're similar. They both don't like to be betrayed. And when they feel they're betrayed, they tend to lash out at the person who's betrayed them. I learned this about Putin from an interview with his high school teacher that I didn't carry out, but that I read. And she said, asked about Putin, she said, "Oh yes, Volodya, yes, he doesn't like to be crossed. And when he's crossed, he never forgives and never forgets." So, if you wanted Putin and Trump to make a deal because you think there's more tension in Russian-American relations than there ought to be, then you have to think about the possibility that down the road, one or the other might have decided that he'd been betrayed by the other. And then if they both felt betrayed, we might have had a real mess on our hands. So it's complicated.
We're going to invite students and the general public to ask their questions. We have microphones set up at the end of two aisles. Please step up, ask your question. We ask you to be brief so that we can get you on record and have your question answered by our guest here tonight. Come right up. We have a limited amount of time to do that. We'll take students first. While we wait for our first student, you told C-SPAN's Brian Lamb, when he asked you about writing a book about Putin, you said, and I quote, "I don't have the guts." Why is that?
Well, there have been some Russian journalists who have tried to delve into Putin's private life and his secrets, and some of them have ended up in a ditch. And I don't want to end up in a ditch.
All right, if you would step to the microphone, give us your first name and what year of study you are in here at Embry-Riddle, please, and your question for Mr. Taubman.
Okay, thank you. My name is Tyler. I am a junior in computer science and computational mathematics, so just history is something I'd like to read about on the side. The questions I have is mostly two parts. So it's, how does Gorbachev view Russian history, in particular pre-revolution times? Is that important to him, and also to the Russian people? Is it important to them as well?
I don't hear that well, so I'm going to get up and move closer to
The question is, how does Putin view Russian history? Is it important to him, and is it important to the Russian people how they view their history?
And Gorbachev as well, yes.
And how does Putin view Gorbachev?
No. How does Gorbachev view Russian history? And
okay.
also
Well, first of all, Putin has reversed most of Gorbachev's main policies. It's as if Gorbachev gave him a playbook, and the playbook said, reverse everything I did. So you might expect Gorbachev to be nothing but critical of Putin. Ironically, that's not the case. In foreign policy, he sounds a lot like Putin. He blames the United States for the way it behaved after the Soviet Union collapsed, expanding NATO, for example, after promising not to. Domestically, Gorbachev has at times been very critical. He's compared Putin's political party, United Russia, to the Communist Party in the Brezhnev era. And he's condemned Putin's arrests and exile of certain businessmen and his crackdown on free speech. But on the other hand, Gorbachev can be, and at times has been, very positive. And he said, for example, soon after Putin took over, that Russia needs a certain dose of authoritarianism. I think he learned a bitter lesson from his own attempt to democratize Russia, which is that it can't be done, or at least it can't be done quickly. And he has gone so far as to say that it may take decades to democratize Russia, and on one occasion he even said it may take the entire 21st century. So it's as if he's giving Putin a little slack, hoping that Putin will keep the lid on, keep things quiet until democracy and the people who want it have a chance to ripen. The problem is, will they? Who are they? Where are they? And will they eventually prevail? And nobody knows.
Want to follow up, if we can. We'll take one question at a time, and then if we have time, we'll come back for a second question. Miss, if you would step up, your name and your field of study, please.
My name is Casey Donovan. I'm a freshman, and I'm in aerospace engineering.
If you could write into the microphone so we can hear you.
Like this?
Can I go up and
Yeah, feel free, Bill.
Okay.
forgive me for walking over into your face, but yes.
Well, my question has to do with the foreign policy relations in Khrushchev's time with Fidel Castro and the Cuban nation, because especially like right when it formed, I always thought that Cuba became more dependent economically on the Soviet Union because the U.S. had put so many sanctions on it that it really just pushed Cuba into the arms of the USSR. But was Khrushchev like looking at Cuba as like a potential way to get into the Western Hemisphere before, like as the Cuban Revolution was happening?
Actually, I know a fair amount about that. When the Castro came to power in Cuba in 1959, the Russians were initially skeptical. They thought he was some kind of peasant revolutionary. And when he declared himself to be a communist, they didn't necessarily believe him right off the bat. But they became convinced, and it was partly the idea of having an ally so close to their main enemy, the United States. And it was also, I think, a kind of nostalgia. The old leaders of the Soviet Union had once been young, fiery communists, and they loved the idea that communists could come to power in Cuba, unlike in Eastern Europe, like Romania or Bulgaria, where the communists came to power on Soviet trains. They brought them in from Moscow. They loved the idea that communists far away from Russia could come to power on their own. They felt a kind of paternal affection for Castro and his young men, not to mention having a military base 90 miles from America's shores.
Was this done, by the way, as a follow-up, as a scare tactic? Was Cuba a scare tactic for Russia against the United States, or did they think, you know what, if we have to hit them, we hit them?
Well, I think they loved the idea of having allies in Cuba, but once they had allies and had declared their support, it became very embarrassing and would have been a tremendous geopolitical setback if Castro had been overthrown. So when the United States began to organize against Castro in certain ways that were obvious and other ways that were hidden, the Russians became alarmed. And one of the reasons they put missiles in Cuba, in the end, was to protect their ally from another Bay of Pigs. Remember, in April 1961, Kennedy allowed the invasion by Cuban exiles, but then declined to provide air support. Well, the Russians had the idea that they were going to try again, and this time they would eliminate Castro. So that's one of the reasons why they sent those missiles there.
Please step up. Your question now.
Hi, my name is Jonathan. I am a freshman majoring in business administration. So I think that the situation we're in 2018 is a little frightening. Now with Trump, if Putin was out to make a deal with him, that could be good. But if in fact his goal is to destroy democracy, as you said, it seems like it's working to some degree. My question is, to what degree do you think we're in a new Cold War? And is there a comparable event in history to where we are now?
Do you think we are in a new Cold War, and is there another time in our history that can compare to what we're going through now with Russia?
Yes, I think we are in a new Cold War, and it's pretty nasty. And it's a different Cold War in the sense that they are much weaker. Did you know that the Russia's GNP at the moment is approximately the size of Portugal's?
Wow.
Compare that to the years when they were gaining on the United States and Khrushchev was boasting about, having a richer, bigger economy than we had. Obama made a mistake when he said, they're just a regional power. That was a stupid thing to say because it riled the Russians unnecessarily. But he was right in the sense that they were no longer a superpower. That's one of the things that Putin is trying to get as much oomph as he can without being a superpower. And he's got technology and the internet and all kinds of ways to do that. But it's very nasty. There's relatively little communication. Even when Putin and Trump meet, they don't call it a summit anymore. During the worst of the Cold War, they called it a summit. But now that's too embarrassing. How can we have a summit with such a rival? Now, has there ever been another time like this? Well, I'm tempted to say that despite all the distinctions between the old Cold War of the 40s, 50s through the 80s and the new Cold War, they're both Cold Wars. They share the brute fact that they are rivalries, enmities, threats perceived both ways, but neither side is ready to go to war with the other. Now, which Cold War is more dangerous? I wonder what you think about that. If this were my class, I would obviously ask you and see what you think. But the old Cold War seemed more dangerous because the missiles, there were more missiles, more warheads, they were on alert. We could imagine an actual war. We came close to one in the Cuban crisis and maybe in the Berlin crisis. So it seems more dangerous. On the other hand, there are some aspects of the current situation that are more dangerous, and I'll give you one. During the old Cold War, an awful lot of Russians did not believe their own regime's propaganda. That is, they were sort of secretly admiring of the United States and hoping eventually to have something like Western freedoms. Nowadays, as I understand it, Russians are much more anti-American than they used to be. Putin has given them what they seem to agree are convincing arguments. Sanctions. We take back, he says, we take back Crimea, and what do? They're trying to starve us or something like that. So neither Cold War is pleasant. They both have risks. As to which one is more dangerous, now, of course, there are other players with nuclear weapons who could get us involved. It's hard to say which is more dangerous.
Let's come over here. Mr. Kenny, your question.
Yes, my name is Jerry Kenny. I'm an old guy who's not a student, but I like to think I'm always learning. So, my question is, I think it was Lenin who said that in order to advance to pure communism, that sometimes you had to take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and that capitalism would be used in the advancement of communism. And we see today in China how capitalism has taken hold, and but yet they have not renounced communism, and they don't have the freedoms there. My question is that you said that Gorbachev wanted to advance democracy, but isn't it true, though, that in his farewell address that he actually supported and cheered on the advancement of worldwide communism? He never renounced communism, did he?
Well, as the leader of a communist country, it would have been difficult for him to openly renounce it. But he essentially transformed it, as I understand it. He took a one-party, monopolistic, totalitarian regime and opened it up in the ways that I described. He thought of himself as a socialist to the end, and he would make the distinction between communism and the kind of socialism which, say, the French socialists promoted in a more or less democratic society. And I think by the end, he himself had become a social democrat. I think by the end, he wanted to see Russia resemble Sweden. Now, you may not like Sweden, but Sweden is a long way from the kind of communism that Lenin was imagining and that Stalin was trying to create. So in that sense, I don't think he believed at the end in worldwide communism. We could argue about that afterwards if you'd like.
Precious minutes left. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening. My name is Beckett. So you say there is a kind of some new Cold War right now happening between USA and the Russian Federation, but lots of Russian businessmen, the oligarchs, have their funds, the money, and capital investments outside of Russia. They're all on some islands in USA, in Europe, or everywhere else. So how can there be a Cold War if they have all their capital outside of Russia and it can be easily blocked by USA or other countries?
The student is asking, how can we have a new Cold War with Russia if Russian businessmen are investing their capital outside of their country?
Assets are outside of Russia mostly. Like they extract the money from the oil and resources, and then they store their money outside. And in your opinion, is Putin finally pro-Russian in general, or in the end he will just use this all as a farce to get the money out of country? And
there's a lot in that question.
Well, the basic, this is an age-old issue. Before World War I, there were a lot of people who concluded there could not be another war because of the growing economic ties among England, France, Germany, Russia. You know, they had investments, the French had investments in Russian railroads, there was a lot of trade. It turned out that was not enough. And in some ways, I suppose, economic rivalries, imperial rivalries created the war. These days, it's quite true. Businessmen want to do business, and they want to make money on both sides and on all sides. But politics, I guess in this sense, I was going to say I'm a Leninist, but I'm not a Leninist. But you know, Lenin said politics takes command. Politics, in the end, overrides. You may disagree with this, especially if some of you are business people yourselves. Politics overrides. You know, if you are convinced that another country is your enemy and wants to destroy you, then the fact that your businessmen want to trade with them seems not only not very important, but absolutely subversive. So, I mean, trade is a good thing, provided it's done on an equal basis and everybody benefits. But I would not, based on my understanding of history, count on economic ties to keep the peace.
Let me ask you about one of the leaders we haven't talked about yet, Boris Yeltsin. What was his impact on his country?
Boris Yeltsin, first of all, Gorbachev hated Boris Yeltsin, and Yeltsin hated Gorbachev. And Yeltsin became Gorbachev's gravedigger, as Gorbachev was the gravedigger, in my view, of the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev contributed to creating his own gravedigger. The two of them were like, I don't know, the Montagues and Capulets. They just couldn't get along. Gorbachev resented the fact that Yeltsin declared himself to be the true agent of change in Russia and belittled what Gorbachev was accomplishing. Yeltsin hated the fact that Gorbachev tried to control him and humiliated him. I have a chapter about their clashes, and they are unbelievably nasty, and presumably could have been avoided had either of them mustered the maturity to sort of hold back from going at the other, but neither could. Now, when Yeltsin became the leader after Gorbachev's ouster, he undertook the crash program to create a market economy that Gorbachev had been unwilling to do. Shock therapy, it was called. And as I said before, it created misery in the short run, although his people would say in the long run it was necessary. And Yeltsin drank too much and got sick. He ran in that election in 1996 when Gorbachev got less than 1% of the vote, and he won in part because the oligarchs, the billionaires, gave him money. It was called the loans for shares. They got shares in Russia's big business in return for their campaign loans. And by the end, Yeltsin was a kind of cripple. There's a famous film footage of Yeltsin. He's flying, I think, from the United States to Russia, and the plane stops, I think, in Ireland. And he gets out, and he's clearly drunk, and he's dancing. So by the end, he was justifiably viewed as Trump would say, a disaster. And hence, Putin was welcomed as a sober, solid, calculating, realistic man. And of course, in Russians' eyes, they now tend to lump Yeltsin and Gorbachev. They say Gorbachev started the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and Yeltsin then made a further mess of things in the 1990s, and Putin gets a lot of mileage out of that.
Finally, you say that Gorbachev gave up power with dignity. I believe you wrote that. And yet I learned that he was actually in a Pizza Hut commercial in his own country, where you see him sitting with a little boy. Why did they allow that? I mean, and they had two entrances into this Pizza Hut. One took rubles, the other took dollars. Explain that.
Well,
Why did they allow that?
Well, Gorbachev left power with dignity. The ads came later. He left power with dignity in the sense that he didn't try to stop Yeltsin and the then president of Ukraine and the then president of Belarus from declaring an end to the Soviet Union. He could have tried to mobilize the military to prevent that, which might have led to a civil war, but he said, no, that's it. I'm not going to. He was always against shedding blood, and he left without attempting to save himself in that way. So there is the dignity. Now, once he's out of office, he has to support himself and his family and his foundation. Yeltsin, at first, allowed him to set up a foundation and gave him a magnificent plot of land with several buildings, which I've been in. And then when Gorbachev began to criticize Yeltsin, Yeltsin cut off his pension, or at least most of it, took away the land, took away the buildings, and Gorbachev's foundation is like an American presidential museum, you know, the Kennedy or Johnson or Reagan Museum, but Gorbachev supports it himself. The state doesn't help him, and philanthropy is only slowly coming to post-Soviet Russia. So Gorbachev went around the world for, I don't know how many years, 20 maybe, since 1991 until he got sick, making speeches for which he received six-figure fees. And he used that money to build a new building with a little help from Ted Turner, and to pay his staff. And the building, it's more than a museum. It's like a think tank. They have seminars, they have colloquia, they have symposia. So he needed the money. And he swallowed the fact that it was earned through commercials. And you say, why didn't they stop it? Well, there was no they. The government was not in a position. He or his family would have had to say, this is undignified, we shouldn't be doing this. And maybe he shouldn't, but he went ahead and did it.
If you'd like to learn more about the books of William C. Taubman, you can go to williamtaubmanbooks.com. I believe that's your website.
Right.
And I highly recommend the Khrushchev book. Before we tell you about the next event in the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series, I want to thank a couple of new folks who are working with us this season, and they come up through the ranks as students. First, Sundus and Diego, who work with us tonight. It's good to have you back with us. Daniela Cabrera on camera tonight. Jasmine Johnson on camera, and Daniel Cabrera is our photographer. To Tony Petro upstairs, who ran the controls to make this thing happen tonight, we thank you. It's always a pleasure to work with these incredible students. And for the students who asked the questions, you add so much of a dynamic to these events. We appreciate it and look forward to broadcasting it on the radio. Let's tell you what's coming up on February 12th, the next event in the series. This is going to be interesting. Eric C. Denson is a scuba diver, and he leads a bunch of scuba divers, and by accident, they've come across two historic treasures. One is a black slave ship. The other is a Tuskegee Airman aircraft. They're going to be here, and he will be here at Embry-Riddle and then join us for a full story on both discoveries. That'll be February 12th, and that'll be at 7 o'clock once again, and 6 o'clock. The doors open here in the Lebanon Auditorium on the campus of Embry-Riddle. Hope you'll come back for that and for all of our events this spring. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please, a warm applause for William C. Taubman. Thank you all for being here tonight. Have a very pleasant evening.